Kia ora koutou. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Welcome everyone, thanks for coming along. Thanks for being part of the 5th WOW Summit. WOW is a registerable charitable trust, for those who don't know. It's a purpose, not-for-profit organisation run by a group of keen individuals. Our aim is to educate, inspire and enable New Zealand communities to accelerate towards a low emissions, regenerative future and beyond. I'm Geoffrey Tompkins. I'm here to introduce our speaker. I'm on the WOW board and I'm here to enjoy the session, but I'm also here to go through a few housekeeping things. First of all, could you make sure your phones are on silent? I nearly forgot. Emergency exits, you'll see they're clearly marked in green. If anything does happen, we're supposed to meet over by the car parks just over there. Toilets are out to the left of the entrance as you come in. Today's session, what does carbon neutral really mean? Clarifying the terminology in climate claims. It says here carbon neutral, carbon zero, climate positive, carbon reduce. What do they even mean, and do semantics really matter? I'm a very pedantic person. I think semantics always matter, but we'll see how it goes. Our presenter today is Carly Green. She started her company EAS, Environmental Accounting Services, who are actually sponsoring this particular session as well. Many thanks. EAS brings a local lens to climate change and environmental impacts, and Carly holds an environmental engineering degree from Monash and a PhD from Dublin University. I'd like to thank our sponsors who are up on the screen. EAS are the primary sponsor for this, but we've got Central Lakes Trust, Crux, EAS, Freshlink, Greenhawk, MediaWorks, Otago Community Trust, Ripon, Queenstown Lakes District Council, Wānaka Tourism and Destination Queenstown. Without their support, this just wouldn't happen, and they've given us a lot of support this year. So very grateful to them. I think that is just about everything I have to say. I'd like to introduce Carly, who's just here. Thank you very much, Carly.
Thank you, Jeff. It would be terrible if I wasn't just there. I would be not here. Thanks everyone for coming along. My name's Carly Green. I am also on the board of trustees of WOW, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. WOW's been doing a fantastic job all this week, and I can see some familiar faces, so I know a few of you have been to a lot of events, and so thanks for your ongoing support. I'm hoping you're having a really great week. I know I am. I just had a really nice morning this morning with a whole lot of students who are operating in the auditorium, trying to identify all these new actions that we can take to try and meet the targets that we're going to talk about today. Today we're discussing around marketing of those actions, but the students next door are actually looking at real actions about how to make change, and I can tell you there's some pretty amazing imaginations going on in there, and I feel quite old because I feel like my imagination has shrunk since over the last few years, but yes, I've had a great morning and feeling really energised. As Jeff said, I operate EAS, which is before we go there, so today we've got about an hour and a half together. It'd be great if I would like to get through the slides. I've learnt from my previous mistakes of opening the floor too early and not getting finished. So I've got some slides and information to give, and then we can answer questions. If you have questions though burning before the end of the session, if you go on to menti.com and use this code, you'll be able to post your questions in there, and then Felicity and I are going to work together to answer them after the slides. So yeah, just make sure you've got access to that. So basically, as Jeff alluded to and I started to say, EAS is basically Environmental Accounting Services is the long name. We are a group of predominantly engineers, scientists, and others with commerce backgrounds, IT backgrounds, focused on providing information and clarity around climate change measurement, reporting and verification. So we've been operating out of Lake Hawea for around 13 years, but I've been operating the business for almost 20. And we're really, really passionate about climate action. That's predominantly how we get through our days. And we work both internationally and nationally in that area. So some of these logos will be familiar to you, and then others not so much. But I guess the majority of our work, around 70% of that, is talking to international clients around the measurement, reporting and verification of greenhouse gas emissions. And that includes greenhouse gas claims that businesses or individuals or governments are making around this space. And I don't know about you, but I feel like it's getting a lot noisier. And that's great. For me, it's a little confusing sometimes because you may not have all the answers straight away, but the fact that more people are talking about this means that more and more people are putting it into their daily lives. And sometimes we might get the communication a little bit wrong or a little bit muddled up, and hopefully today we can just sort of try and express what those terms mean, not just in terms of how do they mean the same thing, but I guess what the intention of some of those terminology is trying to achieve. So 3 topics for today. First we're going to go through carbon jargon. Then we're going to, I guess, focus a little bit on what the trends are in best practice. What is emerging as the terminology we need to be using now, and why those terminology is emerging as the most important sort of use of the terms. And then I guess for some of you in the room, you're here because either you are interested as a business to make some of these claims around your business, or you want to be an informed consumer when you're actually out there buying things and trying to understand what someone's communicating to you. So we're going to look at it from both sides. So you, as someone who might want to use your purchasing power or your decision making to make better choices, or someone who's trying to communicate to clients or your customers about the good work that you're doing. So we'll look at both sides. Okay, but first, why are we here? That existential question I ask myself every day. I'm getting more and more excited about this space, though. I was talking yesterday to a few people and said, you've been in this for 20 years? I go, yeah. You know, there's moments there where you feel like you're out in the wilderness doing stuff that no one else is really interested in. But I feel right now like things are really starting to get a lot more, you know, people are moving, people are thinking, people are doing, and it's quite a good time to be in this space. We're here, though, because this is what we're trying to, basically, we either look at it as a negative side, where we've got to jump off this cliff down to some unknown place, which we don't know whether it actually exists yet, or, like I said to the students this morning, we have to explore all the opportunity of this wonderful slide we're about to take, and maybe it'll be a bit windy, not necessarily straight off and belly whacking onto whatever's down there. Maybe it won't be so bad. So we're basically here at the moment. This is our black line of emissions. You can see it's been going up pretty steadily, or quite dramatically, in fact. And to achieve a 1.5 degree warming of the atmosphere, we really need to be on this green trajectory here. And you can see that's pretty much from today in real terms. This green line is what Paris initially tried to get people to commit to. And these other lines are different modelled options for different sort of policy actions, pledges, and an optimistic scenario. Even the optimistic scenario is not quite near the green one, but yeah, the pessimist in me says that's not so optimistic. But basically that blue line at the top and the purple line are the ones we need to sort of focus on at the moment, because they're the lines that most of the Paris Agreement policies and actions, they're the trajectory we're sort of on. So at the moment, we've pretty much locked in 2 degrees warming, pretty much, out to 2100. And then so we just really need to be on these blue and purple lines to try and mitigate that down to 2.4 globally. So these are global temperatures. I'm not talking about how that's going to pan out in the environment we sit in today. It'll be different for different countries. So global average will be this sort of level. So there's a whole lot of action happening in these blue and purple and you know, even in the orange, even in the green lines. And some of those are being communicated as targets, which are either like a carbon neutral target, a climate positive target, a climate neutral target, which is also different to carbon neutral. And we're even, the government, our government, governments of other countries, and also then organisations are using these terminology to try and communicate how they, how their actions are fitting into these targets. So some of these are presented here from a national point of view. So these are all the climate commitments at the moment of different countries. Some of these have just recently been updated, including New Zealand's, compared to what the original Paris target was. Because of course Paris has sort of been evolving over the last few years. The initial targets weren't strong enough. We weren't going to be able to get on that. We were a lot worse than those blue lines, by the way. So each different country has a different target. You'll also note they all have not they all, but they also have different sort of baseline dates, some 2005, some 1990. But New Zealand here, we've committed to reducing our emissions to 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. How far away is 2030? It's ages away, isn't it? Yeah, so you have to halve your emissions in 7 years. Pretty much that's what we're talking about. So do you know what your emissions are? No. How are you going to halve them? Okay, go home and find out. So basically that's what we have to do. We have to halve our emissions. Pretty much most people are also trying to achieve the same sort of level of reduction. Some countries will find it a bit harder, and this is all they can feel they can commit to out to 2030. You know, that's okay. Probably India, over the scheme of things, haven't really contributed all that much in the Industrial Revolution to say New Zealand or Australia or the US has, so it's probably pretty fair. But they are all making commitments to reduce. All. Everyone. Every single country except Syria, and actually Ukraine is probably now not going to meet its NDC. But Syria and the Ukraine are probably the only ones that are out of the system at the moment. Strictly, Syria is the only one that's out. Ukraine hasn't pulled out, obviously, but they're going to find it super hard now. So basically we're all on the same path. We're all collectively trying to achieve those reduction targets. Governments are one side of the equation. Businesses are also trying to achieve businesses have also made commitments. So these are some businesses that are have made commitments. There are many, many, many others. I've put these here because we've been doing some work in the ag sector recently, and all these businesses are related in some shape or form to the food sector. So these are just a small snapshot, and you can see they're pretty much aligned actually with what the governments are trying to achieve as well. And that's not so surprising really, because you know, of the 100 largest economies, 69 of them are actually companies. So some of these companies have bigger influence in emissions than New Zealand does globally. So it's very important that they actually contribute and make these commitments as well, right? Because without everyone doing their part, we're not going to come anywhere near those lines. And actually, if you think about it, governments don't actually produce that many emissions. Sure, they create the operational framework, they try and put in place policies, and they influence long-term planning. But we as consumers and businesses as facilitating that consumer environment, we're the ones producing those emissions. Yeah. So we all have a role to play. So, I guess the point is that the government policy may now be less influential than market forces, and a lot of these terms that we're going to talk about today are actually coming from the market. They're not coming from governments necessarily. Some of the terms are in the Paris Agreement, but most of these terms I'm going to use today are actually in the markets. So the first misnomer. Okay, so it's not actually carbon. We always talk about carbon. Carbon's so bad, carbon's bad. Actually, carbon is not what we're actually measuring or reporting. It's not what we're actually trying to mitigate. Carbon's not a gas. It's an element. It's the sixth element on the periodic table. We're made up of carbon. Carbon on its own does not lead to climate change. Carbon dioxide does. Carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide are the major gases that accumulate in our atmosphere to increase the thickness, I guess, of that duvet, increase the warming of our globe. So it's not carbon itself, but we're lazy. Humans are lazy. So if carbon dioxide apparently is far too hard to say, it's probably not as sexy either, so we use carbon. So that's the first piece of information I want you to take with you at the moment. So we're actually, when we measure and report, when we're talking about carbon neutral, we're not talking about carbon neutral, we're talking about greenhouse gas neutral. And we're not even talking about carbon dioxide neutral, which I'll talk about in a second as well. Okay, so just to be clear, we are reporting carbon dioxide equivalent is the unit that we use when we're communicating our emissions and any action that we're taking to reduce those. It's carbon dioxide equivalent. So a carbon dioxide equivalent is a unit that we use that basically makes sure that all gases are treated equally. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, they all have different impacts in the environment. And of course there's all the other synthetic gases and HFCs and stuff as well that I'm not going to talk about here because I find it really hard to remember all their long names. So I'm going to use just these three because they're the major gases that we refer to. So when we do any sort of estimation or reporting of our greenhouse gas footprint, it always should be reported in carbon dioxide equivalents, not carbon. So how we calculate carbon dioxide equivalents is we have to, as I said, each gas has a different warming effect. So carbon dioxide, we have to think about carbon dioxide as having a warming effect of 1. So every molecule of carbon dioxide that goes in the atmosphere has a warming effect of 1. If a molecule of methane goes up, say it's from the landfill or from livestock, instead of the CO2, say from driving your car, that molecule of methane has a 27 times more warming effect than CO2. And if it's nitrous oxide, say from fertiliser that's used to grow your lettuce, that has 273. I always forget the numbers because they change. They change because the atmosphere is changing and the impact of those gases in the atmosphere changes over time as well as the concentrations change. So the IPCC update these numbers all the time. So I'm old, I use 24, but I notice it's actually 27 because when I started my degree it was 24, so that's like locked in now. Like I say, I can't take in new information or imagination because I'm too old. So I use these slides, like Felicity's updated them for me. So these are the recent numbers. So methane, 27 times more effective at trapping heat than CO2. Nitrous oxide, 273 times more effective at trapping heat than CO2. So every molecule gets multiplied by these numbers, so then we have a unit of carbon dioxide equivalent that we can add them together. Okay, because without that, we're not comparing apples with apples. So when you do your account, you're looking at not carbon, you're not looking at CO2, methane or nitrous oxide. What you do is you make them all equal and you add them up together and you're using the term carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's the first bit of information to take with you. The last thing I want to say on this slide is we use this over a 100-year timeline. So each of these gases have different residence times in the atmosphere, but we normalise them to 100 years. And that's because CO2 is the reference gas, and CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for 100 years. So who drove their car here today? Yep. So you would have released CO2 when you drove your car. That CO2 will remain in the atmosphere for 100 years from today, basically. If methane is emitted into the atmosphere, its residence time is around 12 years, around 12 years. So it breaks down into CO2 and other gases in about 12 years. So its warming effect is most intensive in that 12-year period while it's methane. Yeah. So we normalise it to 100 years, and that's what those numbers do there as well, to make sure we're adding them up correctly. Oh, so no wonder we're confused, right? So I just want to put this slide up. This slide is from some research, and it's 2 years old now, so who knows where we are now with the numbers. I hope it's changed. But basically what this table describes is all the different ways here that the market is describing what we can call carbon neutral or net zero science-based or beyond carbon neutral. So these are the three sort of categories we're going to talk about today, but you can see there's multiple ways that different organisations are communicating what would be considered, say, a net zero science-based claim. Net zero emissions, net zero greenhouse gas emissions, net zero impact on climate. Are all these things the same? What about carbon neutral? Climate neutral product, zero emissions, zero greenhouse gas emissions. I like this one, virtually zero greenhouse gas emissions. Oh my God. Okay, so these are the types of claims that different organisations are making. So how is it that we can actually know what we're actually buying into, or what we're actually communicating, or what we're actually trying to assess? It's super hard. I don't know, I find it hard. And I think I know something, Okay, so what does it all mean? So I'm not going to be able to get through every single one of those different claims today. We've only got a small amount of time, and I want to be able to leave some time for questions. So in the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to discuss these core ones, mainly because I feel like that's the main ones that people know about anyway. I mean, I'd never heard of virtually zero carbon emissions. When I read that, I went, oh, I'm not going to try and describe that. So we're going to talk about carbon neutral, climate neutral, because remember, carbon and climate aren't the same. Net zero, science-based targets. Have anyone heard of science-based targets? New one. I'm even adding new ones to you. That's terrible. Okay, science-based targets and carbon negative or climate positive. Okay, so they're the ones we're going to talk about, and I'll also throw in offsets and insets for free. So we're going to discuss what offsets and insets are. Has anyone heard of insets? Another new one. Yeah, see, they just keep propping up. It's like it's amazing. Anyway, okay, so who's heard of carbon neutral? Yeah, pretty much everyone. It's become almost like the universal conversation, carbon neutral. What about climate neutral? Yeah. Net zero? Okay, a few. So some of you came here thinking you're only going to learn about carbon neutral, and now I've thrown a whole lot more in the mix. Okay, so carbon neutral. So the term carbon neutral is used when an activity, process, organisation, event or building has zero net emissions. So it's actually not a term that you'll see here. That we've put up two different certification schemes in New Zealand at the moment. So one is ECOS certification and one is the TOI2 certification. Neither of them use the term carbon neutral. So if you get certified to these programs, you would use the terminology that the program uses. Okay, so these programs use two different terminologies. So if you get certified under ECOS, it's zero carbon. And if you get certified under TOI2, it's net carbon zero. They mean the same thing in this context. They mean the same thing. So what this means is that an organisation has assessed their greenhouse gas emissions, and they have effectively bought offsets to become net carbon zero. So they still have emissions. They're not zero emissions. They have emissions, and they've bought offsets to net those emissions out. So they become net carbon zero or zero carbon. But we all know that's carbon dioxide equivalents now, right? It's not just carbon. Okay, so climate neutral. Climate neutral is not carbon neutral. Climate neutral is achieving zero net greenhouse gas emissions by balancing those emissions so they equal the emissions that get removed through the planet's natural ecosystems. This is a terminology that the UN uses. So the UN agreements use the term we're trying to achieve climate neutrality or be climate neutral. You can't be, as an individual or an organisation, climate neutral because this type of definition requires the whole ecosystem of the globe to be in balance. So we can influence that, but we can't, as an organisation or an individual, claim to be climate neutral. It's the point in time when our emissions get down along that green line to be 1.5, so that the climate can deal with the emissions in its natural within its natural ability to do so. So to be climate neutral means that we've actually achieved the Paris Agreement. Yeah. Okay, so net zero. So net zero is linked to climate neutral. So the UN define net zero as cutting greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible, and then any remaining emissions reabsorbed from the atmosphere and oceans and forests. So they're basically similar, they're interchangeable, I would say, climate neutral and net zero. Net zero is more, I don't know, marketable. So net zero will be the terminology that you will start to see more and more about. No one is net zero now. It's not possible. So net zero would mean, well, actually not no one. If you've removed all of your fossil fuels from your operation, basically you've cut emissions to as close to zero as possible. And then any other remaining emissions are absorbed by the atmosphere. Who knows Forest Orchard out at Cromwell? That would be pretty close to being net zero. They have removed fossil fuels from their operation completely. They're electrified. And if you looked at the sequestration of their removals from their processes with the emissions from the electricity, it would be pretty close. That'd be the closest I've seen. Pretty much though, most people are looking at net zero to be out to 2050 is when we can sort of try to believe that we're somewhere near net zero. So net zero is not something that, and it's more of an international position than necessarily an individual position. Okay, science-based targets. Science-based targets have come out from Paris as well. This is a concept where you focus more on your reductions to achieve a 1.5 degree world. So you will set that's what a science-based target is. A science-based target is a target of reductions that is linked to a global warming scenario, okay? So this initiative has been gaining traction since Paris, and it is completely aligned with the Paris Agreement. It's a really, really nice website. The designer has done a fantastic job to engage you in that website, and I'd thoroughly recommend you go and have a look at that. It's basically designed to try and help people achieve net zero claims, because it's focused on reducing emissions as close as possible to zero, and then and basically being in that space where your emissions are low, aligned with science-based targets. It is very challenging to achieve net zero right now, as we said before. But what the key initiative and what I really like about this initiative is that it challenges you to understand your emissions and then set a target for reduction. Not simply understand your emissions and go to the market and buy an offset and make a reduction plan, but actually implement the reduction plan. That's why I really like this framework. It's quite a good one. So whilst you may not be able to make a net zero claim straight away, you'll be able to say, I'm on a net zero pathway because I've set myself a science-based target, and these are the things I'm doing to achieve a world where we can sustain life. That's basically what that is trying to achieve. Super cool. Okay, so let's go into the realm of negative and positive. So it depends on it almost depends on what hemisphere you live in, to be honest. And I think it's to do with the way the toilet flushes. Because if you live mainly down in the southern hemisphere, we're using climate positive. And in the northern hemisphere, climate negative is where this terminology originated. Pessimist, optimist, I don't know. Anyway, it's emerging that more and more people are now dumping the climate negative terminology and adopting climate positive terminology. Carbon negative and climate, see, even I get mixed up. Climate positive is emerging as the more mainstream terminology. Who can have a stab at guess at what this one means? Yeah, cool. So basically, Toitu and ECOS both have certification schemes for you to be climate positive. So when you're climate positive, you effectively understand your greenhouse gas emissions, and then you've got a plan in place to make some reductions, and then you go to the market and buy an offset to offset your emissions and more. So you buy more offsets than you actually emit. Cool. So you understand your emissions, have a plan in place to make reductions, you go to the market, you buy the emissions for your year plus some more, whatever you decide. I don't think there's a limit on how many more you need to buy, you just buy more. And then you communicate that. So that's carbon positive, or climate positive. Carbon negative means the same thing, it's just a different way of looking at the balance sheet, basically. It's whether or not you consider emissions or removals negative or positive from the atmosphere, which is where that's come from. Cool. Okay, so if you're going to the market to buy offsets, what are they? So to be basically net zero or climate positive, you basically go to buy offsets. So an offset is achieved by when you buy a unit of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we're basically, remember, we're using all the same units as you measure and report. The offset has to be the same units that you buy, so you can net it out. It's just basic accounting, right? So you effectively buy it from a third party and retire it against your emissions. So this is a graphical illustration from Toitu, where you've got an emitting entity here. They're wanting to claim carbon neutral status. So to do that, they need to go and buy offsets from a carbon project and net their balance. So as many emissions have to be bought as offsets. Whoops, oh, wrong way. So these carbon projects, this is trees here, but they can also be other types of carbon projects. There are other offsets don't necessarily only come from trees, so they do come from other projects, and we can touch on that later in the talk. But basically, an offset is bought from a third party. So we use these terms offsets or voluntary carbon credit. We use these terms interchangeably. So an offset and a voluntary carbon credit pretty much can be considered the same thing, but I want to talk about some characteristics of offsets that are important to take on board. So as I just said, there was a little infographic there of trees being where offsets come from. Offsets do come from trees, but they also come from other projects. So if you consider a forestry project to be basically the offsets are stored there. They've removed those CO2 from the atmosphere and stored it in the forest. Typically, that forest needs to have some other management and characteristics that are specific to offset programs, and they are that they should be stored there for a period of time. Normally it's 100 years, because remember I said CO2 takes 100 years to be, you know, you drive your car this morning, the CO2 went up into the atmosphere, it's going to be there 100 years. You want to offset that, you need to make sure that the offset you buy is there for 100 years to make sure that that is cancelled out completely, that it is neutralised. Some programs don't require that because it's a bit challenging to keep it there 100 years, but in strict accounting like rules and science, that should be left there for 100 years. Other projects that can generate offsets globally are what they call emissions avoidance projects, and these are usually energy efficiency related projects. A lot of them happen in developing countries where they're shifting to more energy efficient technology, and that wouldn't be able to happen otherwise if they didn't get paid from the money for the credits. So that's an avoidance project where that money from that basically selling the offsets is enough to enable that transfer of technology. Or there could be offsets from reduction projects. So avoidance means you stop something from happening. Reduce means you've reduced the amount of emissions that would normally happen. So you haven't necessarily eliminated them, but they're less than they would have been before. So all of these types of projects can generate an offset, and New Zealand government, New Zealand businesses are buying offsets from all these different types of projects internationally to to offset their emissions. Yep. We don't have an active voluntary carbon market generating offsets in this country, but other countries do. And so at the moment, and I'll touch on this in a minute, at the moment you actually can't buy an offset in New Zealand that can allow you to achieve what was the term on the front page? Not carbon neutral, but net carbon zero. They don't exist in New Zealand at the moment because they don't have the right characteristics for that. So I can elaborate on that too. Okay, so I talked about their different characteristics. Here they are. So for a voluntary credit to be used as an offset in a carbon neutral claim or a net carbon zero claim, they need to have these key criteria. So these are what's called integrity principles, and globally these are used to ensure that an offset is an offset, that you can make a claim because that offset is real, it's additional, it would not have occurred otherwise because it needs to be beyond business as usual, otherwise it's not offsetting your business as usual. It needs to be permanent, as I said, stored for 100 years, so permanent in this case would be 100 years. It needs to be robustly quantified, so we need to have confidence that that is actually a tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent, that you're buying a tonne for a tonne. So that means that you need to know the baseline of what would have happened before and what's happening now. You need to make sure you understand the error bars around that, and you only get credited for the tonnes, and that you avoid leakage. So that means that the project happening here doesn't result in emissions happening somewhere else, that they actually have taken those emissions out of the system. That's what leakage is. So it's very complicated. It's actually quite hard, and I've spent 20 years working in this space. Basically, that's pretty much what my day job's been for the last 20 years, trying to make sure that those offsets are real. Okay, and then they need to also address more and more, actually, in the last decade. People have been focused on potential perverse outcomes from offsets. So these offsets also have to demonstrate that they've got safeguards and considering any sort of perverse outcomes, either from exploitation of people to exploitation of the environment. So yeah, just make sure those safeguards, do no harm is kind of the core principle there that I like to use because that pretty much sums it up. Do no harm to anyone or anything. So you have to make sure that those offsets do that, and then transparently reported. So it means that you communicate everything about this offset to everyone so that the buyer knows what they're buying. You can get all this information, it is available. So if you go to the market to try and buy an offset, all of this is there. You know where the project is, you know how it's doing no harm, how it's been quantified, you can find all that out. And then to make sure it's not double counted, so it's only used by you, it's not used by somebody else, because we can't have it used twice, right? So this is real and operates. So just because you're buying a $5 credit from Fiji or a $25 credit from Australia, which one do you think is better? Price does not indicate quality. I guarantee it. In fact, it's probably the opposite. Is this recorded? Yeah. So just don't use price as an indicator of quality, is what I'm going to say. Yep. You make sure you do your research. All of this stuff is available. All of this information is available for every credit that's on the market. Go and find the information and make sure you're buying the right ones. Okay. So, as I said earlier in the conversation, there's different types of units, and some of them, as I said, offsets in New Zealand to make net zero claims are not available. So we don't have projects that generate offsets. And I want to just talk on the different types of units that are available. So VCUs, verified carbon units, this is a voluntary international voluntary carbon program, offset program. So it creates VCUs, verified carbon units. There's also VERs, which is from the gold standard, also an international program. So they're voluntary emission reductions. And then CERs, which are being phased out, Clean Development Mechanism. These are certified emission reductions. Each one of these are voluntary offsets you can buy to make those net carbon zero claims. These all can be used for offsetting. So what are NZUs? Does anyone know what an NZU is? Yeah. Okay, so New Zealand does generate units in the emissions trading scheme. So these are called New Zealand units, and many of you, who knows here about pine trees generating offsets in New Zealand? No, okay. So basically there's a lot of forestry being established in New Zealand to generate NZUs. So NZUs are units that are basically bought, they're generated by mostly large-scale pine forestry projects, some non-pine, but mostly pine. They are basically issued by the government, by MPI, and then big organisations or firms with emissions basically that are covered by the ETS have to go buy these NZUs to reconcile their account. So that's been ongoing since 2008 or 2009 in New Zealand. So there's been an active emissions trading scheme operating in New Zealand to try and drive down our emissions. Actually, the emissions trading scheme is the government's major mechanism for helping us meet our NDC, helping us meet our Paris target. So these create units, not offsets. So they don't have all those characteristics I showed on the first one of the slides back. They're not necessarily additional. They're not necessarily transparently reported like a voluntary carbon offset needs to be. They meet generally they're robustly quantified. They meet some of the criteria, but not all. So to be an offset to use in a carbon neutral claim, or I keep using carbon neutral, which I shouldn't, I have to adjust my language. It's net zero carbon. To make those claims, you have to buy an offset. You can't buy a unit. So the government's just come out in the last couple of years to clarify that in the marketplace. And so now companies in New Zealand need to go and look somewhere else for an offset because they can't use these units in their claims. They're not, and that's because they're not necessarily additional. They're in a regulatory market, they're not in a voluntary market. And to make a voluntary claim, you need to use an offset, not a unit. Really confused now? Yeah. It's really hard. It's really hard. But I can guarantee if you are trying to make a carbon net zero claim or any sort of claim for your business, you need to look outside New Zealand at the moment for an offset. Because the guidance that's coming out of the International Integrity Office is that these units don't meet all the criteria. And so the government has said these units don't meet all the criteria. We're going to have to we're in an interim phase at the moment, trying to now we have to originate local credits, offsets, to actually make those claims. I want to say now that it's a very interesting environment to be working at the moment, I can tell you. Okay, so just to clarify as much as I can in the time I have. Voluntary credits versus compliance credits. In New Zealand, we have compliance credits. They're called NZUs, New Zealand units. These are not voluntary credits. They are compliance credits. They are used in the ETS to help businesses that are covered by the emissions trading scheme to meet their regulatory requirements. There is a secondary market and you can buy them, and some companies have been up until this time buying them and making these claims. What we know now, because we know more now, is that they don't necessarily meet all the requirements to make those claims because they weren't originally designed for that purpose. They were designed to meet the ETS requirements. The secondary market opened up, businesses started buying them and making carbon neutral claims. Now it's clear that those units aren't fit for that purpose. They're fit for the purpose of the ETS. They're not fit for the purpose of voluntary claims. Okay. So cancelling an NZU on its own does not result in a credible voluntary carbon offset. And that is what the government has said in their latest guidelines. So you can imagine people are scrambling now going, oh my God, we need to find a new source of offsets. And maybe they should be thinking, maybe I should go set a science-based target and just make internal reductions and communicate that than necessarily being a carbon neutral business. So that's where we are in the moment in terms of what's better. So to make any sort of carbon neutral claim, this is the process you have to go through. So, well, this is the process you should go through. You should be certified. You should not make a claim about this unless you're certified to a program. In New Zealand, this is a diagram from Toitu, ECOS do it. I don't know there's any other certification programs. They're the two main ones anyway. So basically, the steps here are to measure, understand your emissions. So first step, that's what you should all do when you go home. Go and understand your emissions. Make a plan to reduce those emissions. So basically knowing what your emissions are help you to understand where you can make change. And that's how you can make a reduction plan, right? So unless you know where your main emissions are, you really can't make a really effective reduction plan. So then you reduce. You have an audit done by someone to make sure that you've done the measurement and you've got a good reduction plan. You've done the measurement properly and you've got a good reduction plan. You then go and buy an offset and then you market that claim. That's basically the pipeline of making a carbon neutral claim. This measure and reduce and audit part here is basically governed by an international standard. So there are standards out there that describe how you do this very clearly. And the same with the generation of an offset. It also has a standard. And that's how they are created. So there's the requirements around that. So that's how you get an offset. So it all seems quite hard, and a lot of to achieve, especially in an environment where you've got to go out and buy an offset. You don't know, basically concerned about what to buy. Is it really an offset? Is it a unit? So a lot of this terminology around insetting is becoming more and more popular now as well. So if you're an organisation or a landowner or someone who has a project that can inset, means that you've got some project on your property or let's take a farm as an example. It's the easiest, and it's most likely coming from the farming sector, this terminology. So I'm a farmer at the moment. Who's heard of AWOC Ekanoa? Okay, so at the moment, New Zealand agriculture is going to be levied against they're not going to be part of the emissions trading scheme, they're going to have a levy against methane. So they're going to have an emission levy, and they may have some vegetation on their property that's growing that they haven't actually created an offset for because there's a big process there, right? There's all the standard and the auditing and all that sort of stuff. But they have this vegetation on their property. So they estimate what the removals are from that vegetation, and they inset it. They do a net account on their property. The emissions from the livestock, the removals from the vegetation, they do a net balance, and that's called insetting. So this is a new piece of terminology that's coming out, particularly to I guess facilitate claims in the agricultural sector predominantly at the moment. So the key thing is if you are insetting, you are compensating your emissions, but you can't claim that you're neutralising them. Yep. So you can say you're compensating for them, but you can't use the term carbon neutral because it's not an offset, it's an inset. And the difference is an offset has been originated with all of those criteria. It's additional, it's transparent, it's beyond business as usual, it's robustly quantified, all those things. And someone's audited that and said, yes, that's true. Insetting, it doesn't have to necessarily meet all of those criteria. So again, it's not an offset. You can't say you're carbon neutral. You only can say you're carbon neutral if you buy an offset. MRV, this is what MRV is in our world, and there's measurement, reporting and verification. This is pretty much 100% of what we do day after day. So we help people measure, we help people report, and we verify that the claims they're making are true. It's very important that this process is followed because we want to make sure that there's no greenwashing in the whole ecosystem. Because most of us either want to do good or be good. So if we are trying to do good, we want to make sure that, you know, the stuff we're doing is communicated well, and that someone who's not doing as much doesn't get more airtime, because it's just really not fair, not right? So, and if you're trying to make positive contribution through your, as a consumer, you want to make sure that the person that's giving you that information, it's real. So basically the key thing for avoiding greenwashing is measurement, reporting and verification. There's lots of guidelines to help. So there are heaps of them. It is a very mature and clear process. And the key thing about this is that the main focus of fundamental part of it is about transparency. So when you make these claims, it has to be very clear how you've come to your measurement through, and then reporting all of that very clearly and transparently. So you can get the information, it's out there, if people have been certified. If you can't find it, it would say that they haven't necessarily met the standard, I would say. Because the whole process of this is that you clearly communicate what you're doing. So these are just some. The middle one here is the New Zealand government material. So there's some interim guidance here for voluntary climate change mitigation. This is where most of those words are around the NZUs can't be used for offsetting and what those terms mean in New Zealand. So if you are thinking about making claims, these documents are super easy to read. They're really, really clear, 10 pages long, not too detailed, give you the information you need in very good, easy to read language. I was going to say something very good, but it was very poor grammar, so I was like the opposite of what that is. That's super clear. The other one I really like is this one, and as I said, I'm a little biased, but this science-based targets corporate standard is really cool. And then also just behind it here is another ISO standard that's being specifically written for carbon neutral or net carbon claims. So there's much more of this material coming out to help us as an industry be more consistent in the communication of these claims. And then over on this side, just to give you some idea, so there's a group called the Voluntary Carbon, the ICVCM, the Integrity thanks Felicity, Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Market. It was established shortly after Paris. We just work in acronyms constantly. I don't even need to know the names because so basically it was created after a group of people got together after Paris and said we really need to make some more clarity in this space. So they've just released some really excellent guidelines for the sector, and it's currently under consultation. So it's starting to emerge this global standard now of how this needs to be done. So that gives us some more confidence to be able to, operate in this space, and then also as consumers understand what people, basically as consumers expect that of the people making those claims. So last few things around inventories and footprints. So basically you'll use these terms carbon inventory or a greenhouse gas inventory and a carbon footprint. So to be clear, then an inventory and a footprint are different. They have different sort of reporting requirements. So the government of New Zealand does a greenhouse gas inventory every year, every country does, and they send it to the UN. That's an inventory. It includes our direct emissions, which are what's called scope 1 and 2. It looks at the direct emissions that are happening inside our boundary, okay? A carbon footprint goes beyond that. So it looks at both direct and indirect emissions. And a carbon footprint is what you need to do if you're going to make a net zero claim, a carbon neutral claim. So you have to look at both direct and indirect emissions. So if New Zealand was going to do a carbon footprint, it would look at all the emissions from electricity and transport and agriculture, and then it would try and calculate all the emissions from all the imported goods that we buy. And then it would also try to track all the exported goods that we produce. That would be a carbon footprint of New Zealand, okay? We don't do that for a carbon inventory to report to the UN to meet our Paris target. We just look at our direct emissions from transport, agriculture and energy. So that's the difference between an inventory and a footprint. If you want to make a carbon neutral claim, you've got to look at your full supply chain, your upstream and downstream, and your direct emissions. You have to do a footprint. So we use these terms scopes to try and describe that. So scope 1 is direct emissions from your operations, and they're usually basically put into these categories. These categories are UNFCCC categories, but basically put into these categories. Scope 2 is electricity only. So it's kind of direct but indirect. So you've got to think about electricity is under your control because you can decide to turn the lights on and off, but you don't actually generate the electricity. The emissions from generating electricity are somewhere else. So whilst you have some direct control over its use, you don't have any direct control over its generation. So we lump this into scope 2. So if you hear scope 2, it's just electricity all the time. And then we get into the hard and interesting part, which is scope 3. So this is all your indirect emissions from third-party sources. So this could be either upstream or downstream of your operation. What does that look like? Well, this is a super cool image, I think, from Toitu that gives you some perspective on the difference between scope 1, 2 and 3. So typically, scope 3 emissions represent probably about 10 times what your direct emissions are from either you as an individual or you as an organisation. Because you've got to think about all of the impact. This is the full impact of your operation, upstream and downstream. When you make carbon neutral claims, you need to include all of those, make an action plan to reduce all of those, and then offset all of those. And then if you want to be climate positive, you've got to go and offset more than that, because that's what climate positive means. So what's up here? So this is your direct emissions. Under some protocols, it's called scope 1 and 2. They're also called categories. So this is a little bit of other information to use, but we typically use scopes. Indirect emissions are basically indirect emissions and your value chain emissions all represent here in scope 3. So these are some examples. They could be business travel, freight, waste, because the waste is basically breaks down in a landfill off-site. Purchased goods and services, investments. So banks are doing these types of investigations into the impacts or greenhouse gas impacts of their investments. Sold products and end of life of your products as well. So you can see it's quite a large. If you're making a carbon neutral claim, you're not making that lightly. You're going in there and understanding what your impact is as a whole. Okay. Yep. So that's the scope and boundary. Really, it's about trying to understand what you have control and influence over. So you do have influence over your supply chain. And you have direct control over your emissions on in your business. Scope 3, as you can see, it's more of an art it's more of a conceptual thing. So you basically look at it and say, that's just huge, how am I going to do that? Well, there's some guidelines there to help people and businesses decide what they can and can't, what they can include and how to make decisions about what you just can't estimate. So there's just some questions you might ask yourself about whether or not you would include what scope 3 emissions you include in your boundary. Usually with scope 3, sometimes this can be too big for people. They just like, I can't do it, it's just too hard. Like, I can't deal with that. What we recommend is you basically start small, understand it, maybe you can't estimate everything, go and get what you can, and you can always build on it, right? It's not like a static thing. It's a thing you're going to have to do every year, because presumably if you're trying to achieve a science-based target, that's, you're basically not something you do once. It's something you continue as part of your business. So just basically work through why you're doing it, what you can influence, what information you have, what you think you should include. Get the information you've got for each of those parts. There may be some bits where there's gaps. Don't worry about it. Just do what you can and then improve it over time. It's called continuous improvement, and it's part of the ISO standard requirement anyway. So a lot of organisations or products are working through this process. They've done their carbon footprint, and they've included their emissions from different scopes. Usually it's done over a financial year or a calendar year, but it's usually over a year, so it's time bound, and it's done whatever period you decide, you do it repeated over time. Again, there's plenty of certification standards and this is one footprint for Toitu, this carbon zero footprint. stamp. And then, there's also products that are starting to put their labels on. So these labels, you can see this is an image from Allbirds. They've done pretty much a life cycle assessment of their product, and they've even broken it down for you for comms purposes. And this is transparent reporting, by the way, so you know where those emissions are coming from, by the types of what proportion of each of these parts of their supply chain or their manufacturing process is where the emissions are coming from. And you can see basically here, most of it's coming in the materials, 5.9, so the slides are a bit, basically this says 9.9 here is total emissions. More than half of that's coming from the materials themselves, but they've included manufacturing, transportation, use and end of life as well. So you can see that there's a full life cycle there and full scope 1, 2 and 3 of their product. And then they report their emissions. Cool. So if you're going to make any sort of claims, or if you're looking to buy products that are making claims, each of these, all this terminology, whether it's net zero carbon, zero carbon, climate positive, they all require consideration of all those scopes. So they would have done an estimate of all of the emissions from their whole product cycle. If they're not included in reporting targets or estimates transparently, I'm reading off the slide now and I shouldn't do that. So basically this is about making sure that you're reporting any targets transparently as well, along with any of these claims. It's really important that you have a reduction strategy in place too, so be informed about that. And then sometimes here, this one is from Unilever. So they've not made any sort of carbon neutral claim. They're basically saying we will reduce our emissions from that are in our direct control, which is scope 1 and 2, and they're going to reduce them by 100% against a 2015 baseline by 2030. So they're being very clear here. The message here is they're being very clear here about what they're talking about. They're not making a carbon neutral claim. They're not making a net zero claim. They're just saying we've got a reduction target and this is what it is. So that's just as important and probably more so about what they're actually doing to make reductions rather than just going for a net zero or a zero carbon. So it's really important to take this mitigation hierarchy where you effectively, take on all of that knowledge you know about dealing with waste. You basically try and avoid it in the first place. Avoid your emission. Make that emission reduction plan. Avoid the emission. You reduce what you can, and then you neutralise or compensate the rest. So neutralise means you'd go by an offset. Compensate means if you have an inset, you could inset. So this is the healthy food pyramid, if you like, of carbon neutral claims. And this is what you should be demanding from those that are making those claims to you, or if you're making those claims. So net zero is really the benchmark for 2050. We're all wanting to be net zero because net zero will get us on that green line. Yeah. So we need to be thinking about, do we want to invest now in offsets to be carbon neutral, or do we want to reinvest that money into our businesses to try and hit net zero? I don't know. I know what I'd be doing in my business. Yep. Okay, so what next? What do you do with all this information? So I've absolutely confused you way more now than what you did when you come in. Awesome. So, yeah, are you confused? Yeah. So use the standards. Be transparent if you're going to make a claim. That's the key message here. If you're wanting to verify a claim, seek that information. And then communicate. You can't communicate this you just got to tell people what you mean. Tell people what you're saying. Don't use those words unless you're verified. So make sure if someone's using carbon neutral, net zero, make sure they're actually verified against those claims. You don't need to be verified to say, I'm going to reduce my emissions to a science-based target, I'm going to make 20% reduction, I'm going to make 50% reduction. You can make those statements and then back it up with communication about how you've done it. So let your actions be your story. That's what I'm trying to say. Actions be your story, communicate what you're doing. Really don't make any of those claims unless you're certified, because you will get done for greenwashing. It's becoming more and more prevalent. So key thing here, look beyond the stamp. So this is an example of a project of a program in Australia called Carbon Positive. We put this one up because it's quite interesting. You can go on the website. Everyone on the website has got certification. They've done a boundary of their business and they've communicated here clearly what's included and what's excluded. Okay, so this particular company is selling carbon neutral milk. So anyone, and actually it's saying it's carbon positive, so it's gone beyond carbon neutral. But one big elephant in the room that I found about this one is, look at this, what's excluded. So what's excluded is milk production and associated farming activities. I don't know. I don't think that's carbon neutral milk, let alone carbon positive. But that, because they've clearly communicated that, they've met the standard, and that's what their claim is. Now, whether or not I think that's right or wrong, the information is there, and I certainly wouldn't be buying that milk above anyone else's because it's carbon neutral, because it's, for me, I don't really think that's carbon neutral. For me, that's the major source of emissions from this milk, not the manufacturing, or not the bottling of it in the bottling facility, which is really what they've only covered. They've neutralised the processing and bottling of that milk, not the production of the milk. So they haven't neutralised their main scope 3 emission here. Yeah. So just when you're making choices, the information is there, make sure you make the right choices. And then also look beyond carbon. We talked about do no harm a little bit here earlier. It's about looking at, you know, the climate in the context of all of the other sustainable development goals we're trying to achieve as well. Making sure there's no perverse outcomes from what the claims are being made. And that's basically looking at basically looking at the full sort of all the information, not just the carbon or climate related information. And that really investment in reducing emissions over time is what we need right now. We need that today, because we need to get on that slide down to 1.5, and so that we can actually make real impact. That's the main point. And I think actions should be celebrated really loudly. If we can reduce emissions by 20%, by 10%, you know, by 50% by 2050, which is what we're trying to achieve, that should be communicated really loudly and shared. If you can do it, then you can tell someone else how to do it. Show them what you did, you know, and that's how we really get traction here. Okay. Phew. Question time. Do we have questions, Felicity? We're good. So I'm going to share the floor with Felicity. Felicity also works with me at EAS, and she was very effective last time, so I thought I'd bring her back. Do you want us to move a little bit?
It's good for the live stream.
Yeah, maybe out here.
So sorry to everyone on the live stream, the original number that was on the original slide was not correct.
Oh.
The number up on the screen now is the correct number to use with Menti. So everyone in the live stream, if you can have maybe a few minutes to sort that out. We also have a lot of questions and only 20 minutes. So if everyone wants to potentially like the ones that they want to hear again, rather than potentially putting up the same ones, because we may not have time to get through them all, I'm just going based on the number of likes given to each question, and we'll try and get through as many as possible in the time that we have. So the first question, which will be a fun one, is how far away is New Zealand from having an offset projects that meet the integrity principles?
Yeah, great question. So the government and industry like us are actively working on that at the moment. How far away are we? Well, I can't give you a date, but we're basically testing a series of tools to try and filter through some of the NZUs that exist to work out which ones could be claimed as offsets. So we're actively working on that. There's also quite a big move at the moment to look at the enabling environment to create a voluntary carbon market in New Zealand. So there is work going on there, but you can imagine, where everyone is like working, but there's sorry, what am I going to say? It's super hard at the moment. There's lots going on and not enough people to do the work. So I think at the moment the VCS is probably, the voluntary carbon market in New Zealand is not necessarily on the highest priority at the moment because there's a big work on the Hayward Kekanoa, big lots of work on other things. But I would say, I don't know, a couple of years probably, but I don't know. I really don't know. There is active work going on in this space, though, is what I would say.
This is an interesting one. I wouldn't expect this with the topic, but is composting or worm farming included in insetting? What about topsoil growth through soil biology? So I guess basically soil carbon.
Yeah, so there's two let's unpack two parts there. One is around composting and I guess that's reducing landfill emissions, say methane. And then the other one is around soil carbon. So both of those in an international context are both offsetting projects that do operate in the voluntary carbon market. So if you went to basically Vera, which I put up, like the Verified Carbon Standard website, Vera, VERRA, you can look on there, all projects that are registered under that program are there. You can find out all the information you want about each project globally that's operating. You will find avoided landfill emission projects there. You will also find soil carbon projects there. You can originate projects in that space. In New Zealand, we could potentially also originate projects in that space in New Zealand if we had a voluntary carbon market. The key thing will be demonstrating that it's additional. So would it have happened otherwise? If not, then it's a project. Yeah.
Top one this time. Is buying Air New Zealand offsets actually viable? So
viable.
Viable is an interesting word, but in terms of how Air New Zealand offsets are currently done, they are basically buying international offset credits, and then over on top of that, they are actually doing environmental impact projects in New Zealand, which may not have a quantified carbon emissions or reduction figure to associate with it. So they generally offset your emissions via using an international offset of something of maybe the Vera standard, gold standard, some from a project that's occurring outside of New Zealand because we don't have the market here yet. And then they're saying we're actually, going over and above and investing money in environmental projects here in New Zealand as part of that money that you're spending on those offsets. In terms of viable, I guess it comes down to what benefit you see from spending that money on those offsets. And I don't know if you've got any more to add with that.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to offset your, I would say the Air New Zealand program, the way they estimate the emissions from your flying is good. So if you look at what your emissions are from the flight on the Air New Zealand website, that is a very robust way. That number is pretty close to being true. They don't use radiative forcing. Yeah, I mean, Felicity's also an engineer, just to go with where the brains are here. So basically they eliminate some part of the total emission. So, but the way they calculate it is aligned with our standard. If you were going to be completely true, it's a little bit higher, but it's not too bad.
Yeah.
And then if it's viable, well, yeah, I mean that's a personal choice as to whether or not you would want to offset your flight, and that could be part of your program of reducing your emissions, I guess, or limiting your emissions.
When calculating emissions, is transport of products included in the equation? Example, a tour operator in Wanaka with visitors travelling by plane from overseas, or a plumber using products from overseas?
Yeah, good question. So we did anyone hear about the Climate Action Initiative that WOW ran last year? Around this time, actually. We got some really great funding from local businesses in QLDC. So we got funding from Lake Wanaka Tourism and Destination Queenstown and QLDC. And so we ran this program with a number of businesses here in the catchment. Some of those were plumbers. Some of them were retailers. Some of them were operators like Cardrona and Treble Cone. And we helped them set their boundary, their Scope 3 boundary. So some of them used, they used those questions that I put up about how you decide. So for Cardrona Treble Cone, it was very difficult for them to understand exactly where all of their visitors were coming from. So they chose to look at where can they make an influence in the behaviour of their clients. So they included the emissions from the bottom of the hill to the top, but they couldn't necessarily track where they were coming from before they came to their gate. So they felt that they could have an influence there, so they did include those parts. Then some retailers in town spent quite a lot of energy understanding where their products were coming from, and they've included all the shipping emissions from all of the goods coming to their store, but not necessarily the emissions from when it left their store to wherever it was going, because they didn't have that information. So they wouldn't necessarily know without surveying everyone. So where are you going and what are you going to do with my stuff? They only had they had control over where it was coming from because they were choosing what they were bringing in. So yeah, so it comes down individually to the organisation about what's important for your business and what are your consumers expecting you to include when you're making any sort of carbon neutral or claim about your emissions. One that often comes up with us is around the emissions around the airports. So Christchurch Airport annually releases their inventory, and I'm going to use the word inventory here because it's not necessarily a footprint. So they don't include all the emissions from the flights coming in and out of the airport. They just include the emissions from the airport's operations, and then they make the claims around that. So when they're saying that's what's related to the claims they're making. They're not including the emissions that they're facilitating by operating. Yep. So that's why it's really important to read that information to understand what they're actually making the claims. Who includes flights? Yeah, it's a really excellent question because it's actually quite hard. So you know when I said before that New Zealand does a greenhouse gas inventory. So it includes all emissions from domestic flights internally, but the international flights are not on New Zealand's inventory. So those emissions are on another organisation that's called CORSIA, which was established around the Paris Agreement because it was basically being missed. Those emissions were being not accounted for. They're not as large as you think in a global context. They have a role, but they are not as large as you driving your cars around New Zealand. So they're not as big as you think. Yeah.
And generally when it comes to scopes of emissions as well, so those flights are going to be someone's scope 1 emissions. In New Zealand, it's their scope 1. Whereas it may be in other organisations scope 3. So that's why we include scope 3 emissions, because it means that it's basically, it gives you a chain of influence in your supply chain, but it's generally being pulled up somewhere else or someone else's direct emissions. So if everyone's accounting for their emissions and trying to reduce their direct emissions, then it's actually going to influence your scope 3, so it's going to look better on your account so you can choose a better supplier, but it's not necessarily going to be missed if you don't include it in your scope 3 because it'll be in their scope 1.
That's why it's super important to include scope 3, right? Because if everyone does that, then you can start to influence each other. And that's why we include scope 3. People say, isn't it double counting? It's not double counting, it's understanding your full influence. And that influence is actually powerful because you can tell someone, oh, actually, you're the largest source of my emissions. What are you going to do about that? Otherwise, I'm going to go somewhere else, because I need to reduce my emissions, because I have to go, if I want to be carbon neutral, I've got to go buy an offset for your emissions. You need to reduce them, or I need to go find a better supplier who's got lower emissions. That's where the value of scope 3 understanding is.
So a more ETS focused question. If a pine forest is cut down after 20 years, how does that square with the 100-year storage requirement, especially if it's used for pellets or wood chips? So we obviously covered in the lecture that NZUs are used in the compliance format, so they're not necessarily having those 100-year storage requirements, but it is actually taken accounted for in the system. And if you want to explain averaging, or
No, okay. So basically, how the New Zealand units are now estimated is that if it's a production forest like a pine plantation, I do this because I draw it all the time. Basically, the tree grows and then you harvest it, and then you replant it and it grows again and you harvest it. You only, in New Zealand ETS now, they take a long-term average of the increase in carbon stock from converting a grassland, say, to a forest. So that long-term average stock now means that pine plantations are credited for 16 years, and that's it. Because the long-term average, the growth, basically you don't get credited right to the top of the forest growth. You only get credited to the long-term average, which is a result of the management of that forest, of the ups and downs of the management. And so basically they get credited for 16 years, and then they, if they have a land use change, if they change that forest from forest to non-forest, they'll have to go and pay go and find those credits again to pay them back. So that's how they deal with the sort of permanence aspect of it. If it gets lost, they have to go and replace them if they've changed the land use.
So it's a risk then in terms of if you are committing to having those trees in the ground and claiming NZUs off them, you are restricting that area to be permanent plantation forestry until such time as you either pay those units back or that's sort of the situation you get yourself into with those ETS credits. And there was another ETS question further down, just rolling on from that, because I thought it was a good one. What is the value of NZU compliance credits if they cannot be an offset? So, yeah, do you want to?
So, I'll give you the actual value. The actual value is about $90. And that's probably one of the highest current global prices for carbon dioxide equivalent anywhere. So that's the actual value. What is the actual value? So basically what that means is at $90, say I'm, who's included?
Steel.
Say I'm a steel manufacturer in New Zealand. I'm covered under the ETS. All of my emissions, I need to report my emissions to the government, and for every unit, every emission that I emit, every unit, every tonne of CO2, I have to surrender an NZU. So that business is going to say, do I go and buy an NZU at $90, or do I take that $90 and invest it in my business to reduce my emissions? So that's the value of them. So basically that's how the emissions trading scheme works. So at around, basically what, up until now, you know, if NZUs are say $30, it's possibly cheaper for that steel manufacturer just to go and buy an NZU off the to basically reconcile their account. But at $90, $100, it starts getting too expensive to there's more cost-effective things they can do internally to reduce those emissions, which is what the ETS is supposed to do. The ETS is designed as a market mechanism to drive change internally, and that driving change will be the price of that NZU. And it just so happens that the NZUs at the moment are offsets from timber, from forests. Sorry.
I just wanted to sound it's like compound interest, because if they reduced it next year, they will need to pay less.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's another incentive.
That's right. You basically, if you reduce and reduce, that's the idea, and you pay less and less, and you don't have to go and buy an NZU. Yeah.
Cool. How can Cardrona reduce its Scope 3 emissions? There are so many cars that drive up and down there every day, many that are single occupancy.
Yeah, so they did a lot of work in the last 2 years trying to get people out of their cars actively. So when we first started working with them, we said this will be one of your largest emissions, and it was, except for the diesel, I guess, up on the mountain as well. But so they put buses on, trying to tell people that, you know, park at the bottom and we'll take the bus up. And if you get more people on the bus and less cars going up, that's less emissions, more effective use of the resource. Also allowed people who are carpooling to park in the closer car parks. People rejected it. They don't want to do it. So Cardrona can only do so much. It has to be you. You have to choose. It's you. You all get out of your car, get on the bus. Yeah, they can provide it, but unless you do it, it's not going to happen. It's the same with that line. It's you. You all have to do it. It's not the government. It's not Cardrona. It's you. Yeah.
And I guess it's interesting for us because we have been involved with the Ski Association in New Zealand, talking with them about how they can make certain reductions, and they were interested about offsetting and tree planting and things like that. So just even doing some back of the envelope calculations for them around if they were to put on a diesel bus and remove those cars from the road versus planting native trees, it's basically about 40 times difference in terms of, they'd have to plant somewhere close to 40 hectares of trees to make up for all of those cars going up the road, rather than just putting on a diesel bus that would still obviously has some emissions, but the effectiveness of moving people together on public transport has a real greater impact in terms of avoided emissions, and permanently avoided in the sense that you're no longer faced with those permanent impacts of making sure that those native trees that they're planting to offset actually stay alive for 100 years to offset the emissions of the people driving up the road. So genuinely, reductions make the biggest difference on those Scope 3 emissions of Cardrona, far more than they could by actually having enough land to plant.
Yeah, they just don't have it. You would have no ski field left to ski on. It'd be covered in trees.
Have we got enough? We've got 4 minutes left, so let's just find another question. Many companies create waste that is inert, but the carbon calculation is based on methane produced in landfill from organic waste, and that if this is recovered in an LFGR landfill, can you talk about this contrast? I know, because I was just in the emissions factors the other day, that we actually do have different emissions factors in New Zealand for different types of landfills. So if you are you're sending your waste to a landfill that is covered. So the thing with landfill is that predominantly if it's open to the air, it'll be producing methane. That methane has a higher warming, because we talked about global warming potentials at the start of the topic. So it has more impact in the atmosphere over a shorter length of time than carbon dioxide. In a covered landfill scenario, you're actually capturing that methane and you're flaring it as carbon dioxide. So you're making it less potent to the atmosphere. And we have, the New Zealand inventory has different emission factors for those different landfills. So you can go on, if you're doing your company's accounts, you can go on and have a look and say, oh, actually I'm in Taranaki, we have a covered landfill, therefore I can use the lower emissions factor for my waste than say I'm in Queenstown, we don't have a covered landfill, I'll have to use the higher emissions factor for my waste. So that does come into consideration. There's also different emission factors for different types of waste, whether it be textiles or organic or solid, or so you can basically go in and try and get the most relevant emissions factor for your situation. And shall we go with one more? Sorry, get the top. Who is monitoring claims that are made by businesses, and how much enforcement is in place? Can you make a complaint if you think the claim isn't true?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of this. It works the same way as, say, the media complaints work. So greenwashing comes from people questioning the claims, just like. So I guess there's two phases. One, if someone's making a claim and it has a stamp, you can be pretty sure that it's legit because someone's actually verified that. Someone's gone through and checked it. Also, you can get the information and read it yourself to understand what's covered and what's not. So make your own. So does that align with what you're trying to achieve yourself? But yeah, if it's a stamp, then you've got then you'd be pretty yeah. It's been third party verified, so it's fine. If it hasn't, then you basically it's up to the community to call it out. There was a recent situation like this in Auckland. I was reading in the newspaper. So a Converse had been putting up murals everywhere, like painted murals across different cities, and they were making a claim that the paint they were using was carbon sink. Did you see this? Yeah, it was super funny. So they're basically saying that the paint they were using was removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So it was kind of like an offset. And so someone went, oh, that's novel, but is it true? And so there were a few people questioning this and bringing it to people's attention. And then they were basically saying that the Converse was saying that the paint was an offset. They were using these terms. So it's really, this is where the terminology becomes very, very important to understand what it means. So if companies are using these terms offset, then, well, okay, an offset is a thing. It has a definition of what that is. Is that really what is going on there? So the paint, as it turns out, it did actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but they couldn't claim it was an offset, nor could they claim that this was carbon neutralising anything, because they didn't look at the full scope of the actual production of that paint as well. They didn't look at all their scopes. So they were making these claims without any transparent reporting of that, and then when someone started digging into it, and yeah, they were called on it, and it was quite a big. They had to remove, and they had to make a retraction. You know, they had to. So it's up to actually the community to call it on that. On the integrity of those claims. I say also, I mean, we put up the example of the dairy, the dairy that's certified. That's certified to a program in Australia. I was quite interested in it because I thought carbon neutral milk, that's super interesting, because we were working with some dairies and stuff, and we went in and we looked at it and we went, really? They've third party verified that. So it's still on you to get that information as well, to be responsible about. So even though it's third party verified, it meets the criteria of their program. It just means that I still wouldn't buy that milk because I don't consider it carbon neutral.
Yeah, and being able to, those programs, the good thing about the certification is that there should be transparent reporting if it's a good certification program, so you will be able to dig deeper and find those things out, and those climate active reports which that was pulled from are actually really great reports. They're only like 6 pages long and very clearly outline what's in and out of their scopes and boundaries, so it's good that they have that level of transparency for a claim like that, so you can actually be like, oh, that's not quite what I thought it was. But it's just a shame that it has to go to that level for the consumer to be educated, and that's why it's great that people are here today, because it's really coming down to sort of bringing up the education of the consumer so that they can feel more confident in knowing what's in and what's out of those kind of claims. And I guess in terms of there's been a number of high-profile carbon credit or offset deals that have gone bad in the media. Microsoft was another big one in Australia with soil carbon that blew up last year. Looked really bad for Microsoft. I don't think they'll ever touch a soil carbon project again. So I think it's definitely the news are hungry for these stories more than anything, and it is a risk. It's a huge risk, and that's why businesses are so cagey around these claims now, because they now know that it's a big risk for the integrity of their business to make the wrong claim.
Because we're all becoming more informed.
Yeah.
And we are going to call it. Yeah.
And I think that's us for time, so yeah.
I hope that was useful, and that there were some answers for your questions. Yeah. And yeah, thanks very, very much for coming.
Thank you very much for coming today. It's a very interesting talk. My mind is abuzz with too many acronyms. I'm going to have to go through it again, I think. And looking out for bullshit is the only way to say it. I mean, there's one company that's advertising at the moment about their investments in New Zealand, saying they're out of oil and coal, but they say out of thermal coal. Thermal coal means coal is still being used to make freeze-dried milk, and for steel production. They're sort of using words to hide the fact that they're still investing in it. So you have to be quite careful when you listen to claims across the board, not just for energy. But I'd particularly like to thank Carly for an excellent presentation. I very much enjoyed it, and I think Carly's going to be around at a number of other events here, so look out for her, because her talks are very, very concise and clear. I really enjoy them. I'd like to thank her, and also like to remind you that there's plenty more going on. There's some films coming up this evening and every evening through to Saturday. Well worth coming to and well worth attending. Thank you very much, Carly.